Welcome to TalentSprint. This is Sylvia. In this video, we will look at direct and indirect speech. As most of you are aware, direct speech is where you repeat, in other words, quote what the speaker has said, right? Indirect speech is where you report what the speaker has said. So remember these two action verbs, repeat for direct speech and report for indirect speech, which is otherwise also called as reported speech. Now, when you change a sentence from a direct speech to an indirect speech, there are some obvious changes that happen. Let's understand these obvious changes through an example sentence. This is an example of a direct speech. He said, "I am unwell now." Okay, so if you notice, it's within quotation marks, right? So you're repeating the exact words said by the speaker and it's denoted within quotation marks. Now let's change this to an indirect speech. So having made the changes, let's read the indirect speech sentence. He said that he was unwell then. Now let's look at those obvious changes. Obvious change number 1, the introduction of the conjunction that. Obvious change number 2, the pronoun I in the direct speech is changed to he. Obvious change number 3, the tense am, simple present tense, is changed to simple past tense was. Right? And the fourth obvious change, there is a word depicting nearness in time in the direct speech. Can you identify that word? He said, "I am unwell now." So this word that is depicting nearness in time is changed to distance when you change it to the indirect speech. So it gets changed to then. So words depicting nearness in time changes to distance. So these are pretty much the 4 obvious changes that we see when we make the change from a direct speech to an indirect speech. Now please note, nowadays this conjunction that is not included. So you could also say, he said he was unwell then without this that, right? So if you come across an example sentence of an indirect speech or a reported speech that does not have that, it doesn't mean it's incorrect. That also is correct. So this is just for your information's sake. Keep that in mind. Now, we've looked at some of the pretty obvious changes that are done when you change a direct speech to an indirect speech. Now, let's go ahead and focus on tenses, right? A lot of us get tensed when we think of tenses. So let's highlight some rules when it comes to tenses and what changes do these tenses undergo when you change a sentence from a direct speech to an indirect speech. Let's take a look at that. So we're particularly going to focus on tenses here and see what are the changes that tenses undergo while you change a sentence from a direct speech to an indirect speech. So we're going to look at 10 such rules. So rule number 1 is the simple present tense changes to the simple past tense. Let's look at an example. So this is our direct speech. He said, "I am happy these days." Apply the obvious changes that we make when we convert a direct speech to an indirect speech. So the indirect speech, again, let's look at it. He said that he was happy those days. So the introduction of the conjunction that, the pronoun I changes to he, the simple present tense am changes to simple past tense was, and nearness in time these is denoted to distance, those. Okay, so let's move to rule number 2. Rule number 2 is where present continuous is changed to past continuous. Let's understand this with an example. So the direct speech is, "I am reading a book," he explained. Now let's change this to an indirect speech. So the indirect speech is, he explained that he was reading a book. So the present continuous am reading changes to past continuous was reading, right? And the pronoun I changes to he. Everything else remains the same. You've included the conjunction that. There is no expression in the sentence that is depicting nearness in time. So there is no change that we need to make on that front. So let's move on to the next rules. Rule 3 is present perfect to past perfect. So the direct speech is, he said, I have come to meet her. So have come is the present perfect. Let's change this to the indirect speech. So the indirect speech is, he said that he had come to meet her. Past perfect tense, again I pronoun changed to he, included the conjunction that, and there's no other expressions denoting nearness in time. Let's move to our next rule. Rule number 4 is simple past is changed to past perfect. Let's understand this with an example. The example sentence is, he said, I went to Canada last year. Let's change this to the indirect speech. Right? So the example sentence says, he said that he had been to Canada the previous year. Let's look at the obvious changes. So I've introduced the conjunction that. I pronoun is changed to he. Went, simple past tense is changed to past perfect tense, had been. And then there is an expression denoting nearness in time, which is last year, is changed to the previous year, or it can also be the year before. Right? Let's move on to our next rules. Past continuous becomes past perfect continuous. Right? So let's understand that with an example. So this is our example sentence. Nelvin said, I was playing cricket. Now let's change this to the indirect speech. Right? Nelvin said that he had been playing cricket. Let's understand the changes. The conjunction that, I pronoun changed to he, was playing, past continuous changed to past perfect continuous, had been playing. There is no word depicting nearness in time, so there's no need to change anything on that front. Let's move to rule number 6. Present perfect continuous changes to past perfect continuous. Let's look at an example sentence. So this is our direct speech. He said, I have been reading a novel. The indirect speech would be, right? So let's look at the changes. Conjunction that, pronoun I changed to he, have been reading, present perfect continuous changed to had been reading, past perfect continuous, and there is no word depicting nearness in time. Alright, let's move to our next rule. Before we move to our next rule, one thing that you need to keep in mind is, so far we've looked at simple present tense to past tense, present continuous to past continuous, simple past to past perfect tense, and likewise. Now when it comes to the past perfect tense, there is no change in the reported speech. Let's look at an example sentence. So this is an example. He said they had already eaten when I arrived. Past perfect tense. Let's look at the indirect speech for this. So the indirect speech reads like this. He said they'd already eaten when he'd arrived. So if you look at the tense as such, I've just contracted they had to they'd, and he had, right? I've contracted this also to he apostrophe d, he'd arrived. So the only change is the pronoun I to he. The tense remains the same when it comes to the past perfect tense. This is something that you need to keep in mind. Let's move to our next rule. So we've looked at 7 rules so far, if I'm not wrong. This past perfect tense does not change and the reported speech can be considered as a rule. We can say that is rule 7. Let's move to rule 8 now. Rule 8 is where will and shall changes to would. Let's understand this rule with an example sentence. He said, I will go to London tomorrow. Now let's change this to the indirect speech. So indirect speech reads, he said that he would go to London the following day or the next day. So the only changes that have happened is, again, introduction of the conjunction that, pronoun I changed to he, will change to would, and the nearness in time tomorrow is changed to the following day or the next day. in terms of distance. Alright, let's move to our next rule. Rule 9 is where modal verbs may, we already looked at will, which is also a modal verb, which is rule 8. Rule 9 is where may changes to might, can changes to could, and must changes to either must or had to. Alright. So example sentence again. I may be late. Direct speech. Indirect speech. Right? Let's look at can and could. Direct speech. I can speak perfect English. Indirect speech. She said that she could speak perfect English. So if you look at these examples, may is changed to might, can is changed to could, and obviously the pronoun I is changed to he, and I is changed to she. Let's look at one example for must. I must complete my assignment during the weekend. She said that she had to complete her assignment during the weekend. So if you look at it again, must is changed to had to, or it can also be retained as must. She had to, or you could use must again. She said that she must complete her assignment during the weekend. So the pronoun change happens and must remains the same in the indirect speech, or you could change it to had to. Let's look at our last rule when it comes to tenses. Rule 10 is there is no change in the tenses when you're referring to universal truths. When it is a universal truth, there is no change. Let's look at an example. So the example is, he said mathematics is a science. Indirect speech. He said that mathematics is a science. So the only difference is the introduction of the conjunction that. Everything else remains the same. Simple present tense, right? So keep this in mind. You know, the other common universal truth is the sun rises in the east. He said the sun rises in the east. He said that the sun rises in the east. So the tenses do not change when you're talking about universal truths. So we've looked at 10 rules specifically applicable to tenses, and we also looked at modals. Right? Will changes to would, may to might, can to could, and must to either must or had to. So please remember these changes. But also, if you noted, we also looked at a couple of words which denoted nearness in time changing to distance. So let's quickly look at a word list that will kind of help us with such words changing from nearness in time to distance. So after having gone through the obvious changes one needs to make when you change a direct speech to an indirect speech, and looking at changes specifically pertaining to tense, we're moving on to word list, a word list where words indicating nearness in time is changed to distance. So this will kind of help us when we are changing a sentence from direct speech to indirect speech. So let's look at a couple of those words. One of the first things is now is changed to then. These changes to those. Tomorrow, the next day. Here, there. Right? These are some of the pretty obvious ones. Let's look at a couple of more. When you have expressions like last year, the year before, or next week, the week after, or next month, the following month. or the month after, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's look at a couple of more. Here, there, hereafter, thereafter, ago, before. We pretty much covered thus, so, yesterday, the day before, or the previous day, last month, the previous month, or the month before, hither, thither, hence, thence. So these words can kind of help us when we are making the changes from direct speech to indirect speech. Now let's apply all of these learnings through an exercise and change some sentences from direct speech to indirect speech.